Hello, Houston. We were kind of in the process of wrapping up our discussion of self-development last time, and I just want to finish that up today before we move into our next gender development topic. And so in essence, you will remember that we were talking specifically about aging, the kind of biological process of growing older. Aging itself often seems to have a rather negative emphasis, as if it's kind of implying both physical and functional deterioration. But in fact, a 5-year-old is aging. When you're aging for the first 20 years after age 5, you're in a growth process. So it doesn't necessarily mean that aging is always a deteriorative process. It is certainly progressive. But it does often seem to involve not only physical changes, but also changes that, for instance, in our interpersonal skills. As we move through elementary, middle, and high school, we are gaining various kinds of personal skills. And the function of aging or the operation of aging is kind of interesting to watch. When I first joined the faculty here at the University of Houston, I was back in my mid-30s, and during that time, I developed an interest in racquetball. I was introduced to it for the first time, and really kind of enjoyed it. And it turned out, as I kind of looked around after about 5 years of being engaged in racquetball, one of my favorite partners was actually a retired member of our faculty who was at least 30 years older than I was. And it was really a kind of an interesting clash of the ages, because here was this full of vigor late 30s person, and I don't know how old he was, but he was at least well into his 60s. And yet he and I could play a pretty evenly matched game of racquetball, because of the fact that although I was young and athletic, I was not particularly sterling in terms of my accuracy. So if I hit the ball, there was a lot of power behind it, but if he hit it, it was guaranteed to go where I couldn't get to it. So it lent to a kind of an interesting exchange between a much older person and a much younger person. There are trade-offs as one gets older. I will never forget a phrase that one of my colleagues many years ago used to use in faculty governance, and that was, his summary was, old age and treachery will overcome youthful naivete and enthusiasm. So there are a lot of trade-offs in terms of getting physically older, but getting smarter in how one operates and so forth. Our society, if you think about it, really clearly recognizes the benefits attributable to aging, because if you look around at most of the leaders of any major institution, they've got gray hair. They've been around a while. They've established some degree of experience either with working specifically with humans or with working in the particular institution that they're involved in. So there are some benefits that accrue to oneself as one ages. But there's some other factors that we also ought to look at definitionally, and that would include things like ageism. Ageism is essentially that you can see the parallel to racism and so forth. But essentially, ageism is existent, extant. There's no doubt it occurs in certain situations, and that is basically discrimination against people based strictly on how old they happen to be. And in some cases, it's simply desired that, for whatever reason, that you have a younger person rather than an older person in a position of leadership or in a particular position. In fact, the study of that we're going to define essentially as gerontology, and that is basically the scientific study of the physiological and pathological processes associated with aging. There's that word pathology again. We seem to have such a negative image of what's going on as we age. But it leads to a fairly fundamental question that I want to spend some time here with you today, and that has to do with, okay, given that it occurs, what causes it? And I can give you 10 minutes of answers that don't overlap at all. There is a stunning array of different kinds of explanations as to what actually is the fundamental cause of aging. Let me give you just a few examples, many of which you'll be familiar with, if not by label, at least by example. One example would be essentially wear and tear. If you think about, for instance, pro athletes that we pay a lot of money to go watch, they are, if you think about it, the star football players of the Texans here in Houston, of the Rockets, and so forth, don't tend to be in their 60s. In fact, they don't even tend to be in their 50s. In fact, they're lucky to be in their 40s, which means basically that starring as a pro athlete is going to be limited, kind of term limited to from whenever you start until sometime into your 30s. If you're lucky, it's the late 30s, but it's rare to have a pro athlete be in his 40s when we're talking about the NFL or the NBA. That is simply a very abusive kind of sport. There's a lot of abuse that goes into that, just in the collisions between athletic bodies and so forth and so on. The net result is wear and tear as one obvious cause of aging. There are some other ones we could mention. Another one is the accumulation of waste products. That is, as you know, our body is set up with certain organs that are designed to purge the various waste products that we generate in normal, healthy living. But our lungs, for instance, are designed to yes, insert oxygen into our lungs, into our blood, but also to remove carbon dioxide. And to the extent that that process ever begins to break down or slow down, the net result is you have a kind of a sludging process that's going on. That is, more and more carbon dioxide is gradually building up in the blood. The body adjusts to it and works with more carbon dioxide, less oxygen, which in some ways would make it less responsive when energy is needed. But there is some idea that in fact the accumulation of waste products is one of the things that contributes to aging. But let's think of some others. As you know, well, pick an example: salt balance, sugar balance. I'm diabetic, I can use sugar balance as an example. In the normal person who is not diabetic, your sugar balance is limited to around 80 to 120 excuse me, of the units that are measured, and I do not know what they are, but 80 to 120 is a normal read for a diabetic. But a diabetic without insulin, that is, I should say a human without insulin, can very quickly run a blood sugar. And by very quickly, I mean in a couple of hours. You eat a milkshake and your blood sugar, excuse me, can run from right around 100 up to 500, even 600. And it gets to be dangerous at that point. But it's normally controlled in a normal person homeostatically. That is, if your sugar balance goes up, if the blood sugar level goes up, certain processes kick in to consume the energy and bring it back down to the 80 to 120 range. Or think about temperature, same kind of thing. It's a homeostatic process. As you get hotter, you start to perspire. And the theory, of course, is that when you're perspiring, the evaporation of that pulls energy away from the body. And so the purpose of the net effect of perspiration is to cool you down. And on the other hand, if your temperature gets too low, then you tend to find yourself shivering. And one of the things that will happen is goosebumps will appear on the surface of your arm. And that has the effect of it's really a goofy mechanism, but it works very effectively, because goosebumps are caused by the muscles that are attached to the base of each of the hairs that are on your arm, or where they used to be, okay? If they're gradually molting off you, that can occur. But the net effect is that those muscle cells shorten, which in fact pulls the skin very slightly, and therefore you get that kind of goosebump effect, because there's a little muscle cell underneath that's pulling to straighten the hair up. The net effect is much additional energy is sent to that area of the body to support the muscle action of the muscle cells that are there to cause your hairs to stand on end. The net effect is that the surface of your skin heats up. And that's a homeostatic mechanism. And in the young, it is controlled very precisely. That is, if temperature wanders even a little bit, you already start moistening up if you get too warm, and you start feeling chilled if you get too cool. So the process, if you think about it, is very precisely controlled. Drifts one way, certain processes kick in. Drifts the other way, other processes kick in. It's a homeostatic balance. One possible explanation for aging is that what happens with age, for a variety of reasons, is that the set point, instead of being right there for temperature, gradually widens, so that your body becomes essentially more and more tolerant of being slightly warmer or slightly cooler. Now that in and of itself, I mean, whether you and I are operating at 98.6 or 98.1 or 99.1 isn't going to make a big difference in the brilliance of our thinking or anything else. But if you multiply that across all of the other things in the body that are controlled homeostatically, you could have a potential explanation for aging. The idea being that in somebody my age, yeah, everything is kind of at the midpoint, but there may be some situations where, for instance, sugar level is high at the same time the temperature level happens to be high in the acceptable range. And if you multiply that across various other combinations, things like high sugar level when the temperature is high, even in a normal person, creates a fertile breeding ground for various kinds of invading organisms. And so the idea that we're kind of in homeostatic imbalance may, under certain conditions across several systems, lead to things that don't really help our body, that is, that lead or contribute to aging. Another possibility is autoimmunity. This would make it aging an inside job, basically, which it probably is anyway. But if you think about it, one of the abilities of our body that keeps us happy and healthy is the ability of the cells within our body to recognize when there are invading cells. When cold germs or various kinds of evil germs get into us, the body recognizes our temperature goes up, there's a fight on physiologically to make sure that our system can ultimately beat down and remove, destroy those cells. But let me toss in another thing here in that mechanism and cause you to recognize or remind you of the fact that you have probably in biology read at various times about the fact that when cells reproduce, there is an infinitesimally small error factor that builds into that any given time. So that there are some rather interesting theories that look at the fact if you take a cell and track its progressive divisions over the course of time, how many times, and that's one of the ways they express it, how many times can the cell accurately produce itself into the next generation? And there turn out to be mathematical limits, demonstrable, as to how many of those reproductions can actually go forth where the end member, after 14, 16, whatever number of cell divisions, really accurately reflects the one that started dividing at the beginning. So that would be another possibility, that essentially what happens is that in those progressive reproductions, which are built into us, I mean, that's how we repair a scratch on our arm, is essentially reproduction of cells. But there may come a point, as those cells are reproduced, when the body that started it all cannot recognize the cells at the end of that progressive division. In which case what happens is the immunity system comes back and hinders the ability of those newly created cells to contribute to the operation of the original body, the one that started it all off. And so what aging would represent in that case would be simply a breakdown of the autoimmunity system, that you and I gradually internally lose the ability to recognize our cells. And that leads to various kinds of operational difficulties. As I said, there are a huge number of different theories as to what actually leads into aging. Another one could simply be the idea that there is a gradual accumulation of waste products that occurs, that in the cell divisions that occurs, if not everything is utilized, it still remains in the body. And it may be another thing leading to the sludging of the overall circulatory system as yet another example. That one is somewhat more theoretical in its import, but it is a potentially contributing factor. We could even look at it as this is a kind of a pessimistic view, but maybe what you and I are doing is really running on a kind of a parallel to a computer program. And as you know, at some point in a computer program, you come to, in the old format, a $stop sign. That is, you get to the end of the program. And might it be that we are in fact playing out a master plan combined from the cells of our mother and father? It might be pre-programming that leads to the gradual change in life that we experience, and there may be a computed end not technically computed, but a determinable end based on the cells that are actually combined to create you and I. And beyond that, I also want to suggest that in addition to the ones that we've been looking at here, let's say add a few others somewhat more general that also might contribute. And that would include things like heredity. You're going to see that some of these are overlapping with other ones that I'm talking about here. But if your grandparents, if you think about them, if they die at 89, 87, 91, and the youngster among them dies at 86, really didn't have the stamina, you're going to live a long time. I mean, don't plan your life around dying at age 64 if every one of your grandparents lived to at least 86. Now, I've just chosen a random set of numbers there, but the point to be made is that longevity is ultimately inherited. Among the things that makes your parents and your grandparents live long is a set of abilities and skills that are built into you in the same way. You are their product, and as such, you need to look to them. One good way to estimate, a good predictor of your age at death, would be simply to average the age of your 4 grandparents and their death. That would be one early start on an estimate of how long you are likely to live. But then, given the modern society and environment we live in, you'd also have to factor in some kind of a fudge factor for the idea that you and I, live in the healthiest environment that in some ways humans have ever created for themselves. Now, we can talk about a lot of different things environmentally that are not perfect, but the diet that we have is really remarkably healthy. And the result is that you and I are a lot more rugged, and that may be one of the explanations for the thing we were talking about the other day, where processes are beginning to spread out. People don't tend to retire as early, and certain sexual characteristics in some situations are beginning to occur and develop earlier and earlier. But those are examples of hereditary factors that we need to consider in looking at the things that may impact or cause aging of a particular nature to occur. There are also a variety of environmental factors, some of which I've identified specifically already, that we could throw in here. One good example, for instance, would be exercise. That is, people who exercise tend to live longer. The evidence is pretty clear, not precise, but pretty clear, that those who exercise and maintain an active regimen of exercising tend to have a historical precedent for living longer. It develops a healthier body to begin with. Think of all the factors in our environment that have a negative effect. Stress. We're going to actually have a whole section of this program course talking about stress specifically. Smoking is another example. I mean, the tendency of that to occur among teenagers is thankfully beginning to drop as they come to realize parents were right when they start yelling at you if you smoke. But the data is pretty clear-cut that smoking does, in fact, cause detrimental effects. Another example that's really leading to is air quality and the impact that it has on us. There was an example here in southeast Texas just this year. Early in 2010, there was a tanker collision over in Beaumont. And one of the effects of that, when the tanker itself was ruptured, was the release of, I don't remember, it was ultimately well contained with Texas sweep-up authorities. But for a while, and by that I mean several hours, there was some really intense sulfonated air being breathed. I think the primary thing was hydrogen sulfide, if I remember my chemistry correctly. It was the smell of rotten eggs, but really intense smell of rotten eggs. And there has been some ruminations since, some worry among public authorities that we really don't know what the long-term effects are of breathing that kind of air. And in that case, if you were in Beaumont at that particular time near the collision, you really didn't have any choice. There were some areas that were breathing, the residents of whom were breathing that air for as much as 4 or 5 hours with really simply no relief from the H2S that was dumped into their system over and over. Many such things like that are in the air, not always as obviously detectable as rotten eggs. But we don't have a lot of long-term studies on what the effects of those are. If we're designed to operate with oxygen and expunge carbon dioxide, it stands to reason that if you're bathed in things like hydrogen sulfide, the effects may not be entirely positive on you. Another factor that could be quite negative is weight. If you carry too much weight, it puts pressure on your knees, it forces your lungs to have to work harder, and in fact, because of all the excess fat, to have less room for breathing, and so forth. If you're burdened with illness, that can also have detrimental effects long-term on your ability to survive. So there are just a lot of factors that are negative, but basically environmental, that we encounter and impact the longevity of our life. When you get into retirement, that's another one. Every now and then a relative, because of just there's no room in anyone's family, a relative or you may find yourself ending up being in a retirement home. And the literature on those over the long run, people who are in retirement homes, is not particularly positive. Retirement homes tend to have detrimental effects on people's longevity. Some have published kind of pessimistic studies on, if you get into a retirement home, you die in 6 months, 8 months, whatever. But there are a couple of factors over those studies that have been done that have really seemed to demonstrate that there are two things that are really important to surviving and thriving in a nursing home or retirement village of some sort. One is the importance of maintaining control over your own environment. Okay? That is the one thing that's lost, or seems to be lost, may seem to be lost in the head of somebody who is actually now in a retirement village, is that, gee, I can't eat when I want. Gee, I can't this. Gee, I can't that. And all sorts of things where they sense that they've lost control of their environment. Giving them, even if it's the appearance, nonetheless, giving them control over the environment in which older folks find themselves goes a long way toward maintaining their body health, their physical health in a nursing home situation. And then there's a second factor that also turns out to significantly impact what's going on in a nursing home, and that is to make sure that the residents themselves remain well informed in decision making. That is, you need to keep them plugged into the way in which the nursing home is governing itself, why rules are created, why they're extant and being utilized, and so forth, and to give them, the participants, a full explanation for what's going on, why we're doing what we're doing, and so forth. And to the extent that you can convert that back into giving them some control over whether we eat at 5 or 5:15 or 5:30 or even 5:45, that appearance of control based on being well informed, those are probably the two most important factors in determining successful adaptation in a nursing home. Again, it's generally an environmental effect. We could also look at another one that has to do with the effects of cellular aging, as but one among several theories in this particular area. We've talked about it a little bit already. But each time a cell reproduces, the chromosomes pair and divide. And the question, of course, is with what precision? How accurate is that subdivision? How well does the second cell reflect the original one that started the or second cells reflect the accuracy of the elements of the original one that started the process? There are a number of different sub-theories that factor into this, one of which has to do with the elasticity of our skin. That is one of the factors that is impacted by the cells of which we are constituted at any given time. I would suggest, for instance, if each of you, just where you're sitting, whether you're viewing even at home, what you might do is just take the surface on the top of your hand, the skin on the top of your hand, use the fingers of the other hand to pinch it up and then release it. Get it all gathered up in your fingers and then simply release it. Notice how long it takes for that skin to flatten out again. Okay? What you're dealing with there is a substance called collagen. Collagen is an elastic fiber that is built into our cells. It's an elasticity, which is a feature of our cell. It's a basic structural component of connective tissue, the net result of which is it's composed of large, fibrous, functionally elastic molecules, and they normally tend to return to their particular length or position, whatever it happens to be. Like ropes, they can coil when they're not in use, that is, they shorten up to their normal resting state, and they're extremely resistant to stretching. That's the reason that you look pretty much physically this morning like you did when you went to bed last night. Yes, we tend to sag a little bit during the course of the day, but the body re-extends itself during the course of the night. So each morning when you get up, you are essentially the same height. But let me show you what happens to that process during the course of aging. We will take this late 60s hand. I actually have a birthday coming up tomorrow, so today's a good day. I'm younger than I'll ever be again. But look at what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do is the same thing I recommended you do just a minute ago. And notice how long let me see if this is maybe a good angle to see it. Notice how rapidly my skin returns to the resting position. And you can see that there's kind of a residual lump there for several seconds. It certainly is not snapping back immediately. So it takes a couple of seconds, 3, 4, 5. And that's something that slips with age. That is, that number, the return time takes longer as you age. Okay? If you demonstrate it on yourself, I am sure, being younger than I am, as most of you are, the return is a lot more rapid in your case than it is in mine. So that gradually, that's one of the things that essentially accounts for sagging. I remember many years ago, Joan Rivers was interviewed on one of the late night talk shows, and she commented to the host on the fact that she had just had had a rosebud tattoo. Tattooed on herself, and the host got all interested in, oh, can we see it? And her reply was, well, no. It started out as a rosebud. It's a long stem now. And what she was referring to, of course, was the fact that her body with age had been sagging. But that collagen cell is an interesting explanation for why it is that with time it does sag. The body does sag because, yes, it's resistant to that kind of pressure, but over years of the same kind of pressure, you are going to have that gradual settlement process that occurs in the course of aging. So there are a lot of different explanations for why this kind of snap back to position actually occurs and why you gradually lose that over time. The overall explanation for aging, which is kind of what I've been burdened with talking about, is lengthy and quite complex. Some of those are more theoretical than others that are directly experimentally demonstrable, but there are a lot of different processes that lead to aging. One of the obvious follow-throughs from aging, in addition to the collagen theory that I was talking about, is the process of dying and death. It always amazes me when you see a book entitled Death and Dying. It seems to me that puts the cart before the horse. Dying is a process we go through before death actually is achieved. So we really ought to put dying first. There are a lot of different attitudes publicly as to how death should be dealt with. One of the things that we can talk about is what's called a death system, which is basically a collection of the rituals or procedures in terms of which a society handles death. You understand that in some societies, the elderly, or the power of the society is simply vested in the elderly, who are entrusted to maintain group betterment, and so forth. But that's a social decision that any particular society makes. We deal with death in a kind of conflicted way, basically, sometimes respecting it and other times simply trying to ignore it. But one of the more interesting theories of sets of research that has dealt with this is the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, an MD who did a medical doctor's analysis of and I'll come back to critique that here in a little bit, but she was one of the first to propose a stage theory of dying. That is, she argued, presented and defended that there were actually 5 stages that we go through in the course of dying. And she didn't make individual differences an acceptable element here. She assumed that everybody went through these processes, and that the first thing that happens is that you find as stage 1 denial. Okay, that can be reflected in a lot of different ways. For instance, you know, when somebody gets news of their impending death, where there's cancer or whatever, their initial reaction to it is, I'm going to go get another opinion. Now, certainly you're entitled to, but the very idea that this doctor that you've trusted for years now, who suddenly tells you, you've got cancer, all of a sudden where everything else was fine, this one you're going to challenge. It's a form of denial. Some people will do it more strenuously and more vigorously. Others are, you know, okay, what do we do? How do we deal with it? The second thing, according to Kubler-Ross, that occurs is anger. That you get mad at it. You're shaking your fists at the heaven. Why me? Why now? And so forth. Anger, Kubler-Ross suggests, is the second thing that we encounter. Then, according to her, stage 3 that we move into essentially involves bargaining. If you'll give me another year, I'll have time to do all the things I've always promised to do. Kind of a cleanup act is being proposed there. But it's bargaining, essentially, that's going on against whatever power you think has visited news of your death upon you. The fourth thing that eventually happens, according to Kubler-Ross, is that people who are facing their death imminently get depressed, having gone through all these other processes and recognizing that it's had no effect on the fact that, yes, the data is still there. You're going to die over this interval of time, and so forth. And that this, in turn, eventually leads to a sense of acceptance. That is, you've gone through all the machinations, but eventually you simply come to accept that, in fact, death is imminent, if it's a short-term notice, but that it is coming, and work in terms of that. What causes difficulty with this theory is simply the lockstep fashion in which Kubler-Ross argued that it occurred. That is, she didn't make any allowances for individual differences. You are simply assumed, according to the Kubler-Ross's theory, to lockstep go through these 5 steps, particularly when you get imminent news or your sudden news of your imminent death in a given situation. It caused a lot of controversy as the theory was proposed, and there was, in fact, Camille Wortman, employed in Michigan at the time I knew her when I was out at Stanford, had a very interesting other kind of account for what was actually going on. And I really think, as I've thought about it, that hers, Wortman's, makes a lot more sense. So that what she's essentially arguing is that the whole notion of a typical response is wrong. That you and I react in many different ways to emotion-evoking situations. For Kubler-Ross's theory, the question that could be posed is, well, what evidence does exist that those steps occur? And in fact, it is weak at best, it's often anecdotal, and it's quite subjective. The problem is that believers tell people how they should react. Nurses, for instance, who believe in Kubler-Ross's lockstep, this is what's going to happen, are actually lecturing to patients about how to behave. No, let's see, you've just learned you're supposed to be in the denial phase, and so forth. And if a patient ever happens to ask for a glass of water which doesn't get responded to when the buzzer is rung, and they've been ringing for an hour, that patient, it seems to me, given what you and I pay to be in the hospital these days, is perfectly entitled to be angry when the water does finally arrive. But a nurse might dismissively simply say, you're just in the anger stage of adapting to your death, if not to the patient, then implicitly to themselves. So that there are some problems with stage theory per se, that people essentially tell people how to behave in terms of the theory. Legitimate complaints may perfectly be ignored in that kind of a situation. And those who don't follow the stages in the lockstep order that was predicted are viewed as deviant or neurotic or somehow pathological in the way in which they're dealing with their own death. And what Wortman essentially suggested, which I think has a lot of wisdom behind it, is that really it is not a lockstep, 1 leads to 2 leads to 3 kind of process, but rather what you're really seeing there is a set of the primary ways in which people tend to deal with news of their impending death. But what Wortman was suggesting is that any of those processes, not necessarily all of them, may typify how somebody reacts to their death. Okay? What I would suggest is, for instance, if you're an assertive person and you suddenly get knowledge of your death, the likelihood of your reaction to this news is going to be an assertive one. Well, let's see what we can do about that. Are there medicines I can take? Are there activities I can get into or get out of? Whatever. But that the way in which we fundamentally, what Wortman is essentially arguing is that the life that you've led is probably going to be the best single predictor about how you deal with the most recent event, news of your imminent death. And I think there's a lot more appeal to that kind of an approach. It certainly prevents us from being locked into only these kind of responses when we have news of our impending death. Now what I want to do, having beaten aging about as much as I want to, is jump into looking at the next general section, and that is gender and behavior. Probably won't spend quite as long on that. But there are some rather interesting things that we have developed around the idea of gender. When Charlotte Whitten was inaugurated as mayor of Ottawa some years back, she included during her inaugural address the following comment. I love this. Whatever women do, they must do twice as well as men to be thought half as good. And her tagline was, luckily, this is not difficult. And that's what drew the laugh in the inaugural address. Someone else, I believe it was Bette Midler, but I am not able to track down the original source of this, but you'll recognize it, was heard to say essentially, remember, Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did backwards and in high heels. And so there is some tussling that always goes on between men and women in their roles as men and women. So before we get started, what I'd like each of you to do is to take out a sheet of paper and number from 1 to 20 down the side. I'm going to read to you a series of words, and what I'd like you to do is to put on your paper next to the numbers 1 to 20, so you can go back and identify which letter you put by each number that I've asked you to write. What I'd like you to do is put an M if you think the word predominantly applies to men, and an F if the word predominantly applies to women. So if it's a masculine-oriented word, put M. If it's a feminine-oriented word, put W or F in that situation. So let me just read the list to you without any other glamour associated with it, and just do your own read on to which sex you would most typically apply, or that you think this word is normally applied by other people, whether most people tend to associate each of these characteristics typically with males or with females. Okay? Number 1, family-oriented. Number 2, assertive. Number 3, talkative. 4, silent. 5, ambitious. 6, considerate. 7, dominant. 8, understanding. 9, athletic. 10, emotional. 11, jailbird. 12, extrovert. 13, introvert. 14, listener. 15, interrupter. 16, polite. 17, considerate. 18, mechanical. 19, gentle. And 20, self-confident. Self-confident. What you might do is go back through and pull out these particular numbers, because in studies that have been done with these words in the past, this is roughly a breakdown of how the words tend to be associated. That is, the words numbered 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, and so forth tend to be more often associated with men than women, and the words 1, 3, 6, 8, 10, and so forth tend to be more often associated with women. Okay? Check and see how your list balances out in terms of whether you agree with the majority or not. I will come back and talk about that a little bit later, but I find it rather interesting. There are several things that I'm going to spin off of that here as we get into it. What we're looking at basically here are gender stereotypes. Okay? And what I'm going to do is to define a gender stereotype as essentially a widely shared belief about males' and females' abilities, personality traits, and social behavior. Okay? It's essentially, it's what people think about the nature of the typical man or typical woman. What are the attributes that they tend to associate to each sex? And the question then has been asked of by researchers in a variety of ways. Janet T. Spence, formerly at the University of Iowa, who concluded her career at the University of Texas, actually got into this whole area in a rather fascinating way. What she did, among other things, was to develop a measurement instrument still available, which is called the Personal Attributes Questionnaire, or PAQ. It's a measure of sex role stereotypes and one's relative balance in terms of masculinity, femininity. Which end of that scale do you find yourself on, or somewhere in the middle? So it's essentially a measure of sex role stereotypes and masculinity, femininity. In the mid-70s, when that scale was first developed, was first used, there were 54 items on that list that were typical male, typically rated differently for males than for females. Okay? The same study was repeated a decade later, that is in the 80s. And what was found was that 53 out of 54 words that had leaned one way or the other enough to make it a significant association either with men or with women. In 53 out of 54 situations, the lean was in the same direction. That is, the association of particular words was the same, whether you were dealing with men or women. That is, there was functionally no significant change in those words. And in the times that I have seen it repeated since, essentially the same stability is there. We tend to think of men in a given way, and are stable in those thoughts, and we tend to think of women in a given way, and we tend to be stable as a society in those thoughts. And that what tends to happen is that they tend to appear as occupying essentially opposite ends of a wide variety of different continua. One example of that is indicated in your text by White and Lloyd, Dunn and Hammer. Finally got that correct. I'm so proud. Figure 10.2 is charging at exactly what I'm dealing with, exactly what I'm talking about here. Now, if you look at those adjectives, think about them for just a second, but among the adjectives that were applied to men and to women, I noticed, by the way, that number 6 and number 17 are identical. I've used this thing for 10 years in various kinds of demonstrations, and only this morning did I discover that, wait a minute, 6 and 17 are the same. So now what I do is offer that defensively as a control situation. I'm really checking and put that in there to see if, in fact, you gave the same rating to number 6 as you did to number 17. You'll have to answer that for you. That way I've covered myself with glory in terms of having made an error. But if you look at those things for a minute, how would you typify the words that are applied to the men? In that, what would be a summative word that you might apply to that group? Is there a way you could characterize them?
They're all kind of action words.
Okay, yeah, I think that is true. They're concentrated. There's another factor I'm going to cite that I think you can pull out of this. Jailbird is not necessarily action-oriented, but yeah, I think that would work. I had in mind the idea of essentially they're focused predominantly on one's own self-interest. Okay, they're concerned with what might be called, some have called agency. Okay, that the words that identify men or typically are associated with them tend to deal with their own self-interest. On the other hand, if you look at those adjectives, is there a single word that you might reflect on as applying to, how could you summarize the words that are there relative to females? And in that case, the word that I would suggest that others have suggested that I think is reasonable is communion. What they're dealing with is they tend to be more other-oriented. They're dealing often with relationships with other people. Kind of in the role that mom has in a family situation. She tends to be the social agent, she tends to be the integrator, she tends to be the one that kind of assumes as a responsibility the job of keeping the family functioning, keeping them together. And in fact, you can see it to a certain extent in the words that are used in that particular situation. One of those things is a word that I would pull out here that you'll already be familiar with, is the idea of stereotype. A lot of those could be called essentially stereotypes. And the question I would pose to you is that if you want to think of those as stereotypes that we apply to each other, you're a man, therefore you are, and we list these things, you're a woman, and therefore we list these things, are those simply stereotypes? And would they be... Is it kind of sexism combined with racism? Is that essentially what we've got there? And the answer would be no, as long as you adapt that in the face of interacting with a particular person. That is, if we're looking at a general masculine person or feminine person, and these can be applied, that's fair. I mean, that is a stereotype. It's simply a shorthand summary of the way people normally react or would expect to be reacted to. And that's not a prejudice unless you fail to modify it and deal with everybody in exactly the same way. I remember a coach many years ago who dealt with my son, and the sex typing that went on in his conversations, I am sure, carried right over into the locker room as you're a tiger, you're a killer, you're going to knock them dead, and so forth and so on. It was just a very kind of stereotypic but very focused building athletic ability somehow in the approach that was used there. The general differences that are reflected there have led to some rather fascinating research over the last 10 or 20 years. Consider, for instance, if you think of a character in our general society, a black female has a whole series of excess baggage attached to that role as a member in society. And it's interesting that the research has begun to occur, indicating that black women, relative to white women, let me put it the other way around. White women are rated more often as dependent, passive, and emotional than black women. What is gradually developing as a stereotype that we associate to black women tends to be essentially faculty governance as a major role that across the society they tend to assume for a variety of different reasons we could get into. But it's but one example of the way in which sex leads to certain kinds of associations with one's race, the sex within that race, and so forth and so on. We do know that within race there is differential discrimination occurring. Lower class women certainly are rated as significantly dirtier, more confused, irresponsible, inconsiderate, and hostile than middle class women, simply as a function of where they are in the overall social hierarchy among whites. So there are a lot of different ways in which we can classify ourselves based on our sex, race, and so forth and so on. Go back to that list for a second. What I've done now is not associate them as male or female, but pick out, go review the list quickly in your head as you're looking at it there, and pick out 4 or 5 of those words that you think best represent you. And you might want to even write them down in your notes there. Which column, which words would you say among the 19 that are reflected there are most directly applicable to you? Have you got them? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and back up. I hope it doesn't mess up the computer, but I want to back up to the list that showed. There we go. Did the words that you selected come predominantly from either the male or the female column? And I don't need an answer from you directly. I'm just posing that to you, because what I'm really leading into by way of that demonstration is to suggest that if you think about it, really what happens is in a study that goes back even into the late 70s, early 80s, investigators found out that both men and women draw from both sides of the scales when they are rating both men and women. What tends to happen here is that in essence, and I want to make sure that I do this in the order that I intended to, and that is that basically our analyses of ourself are much more specific. That is, they tend to be much more free in terms of which side of the list we draw words from, because you and I are very accurately informed about what our strengths and our weaknesses are, and so we're not above calling ourselves an introvert or an extrovert, depending on what we really understand ourselves to be. Given that concept, that theoretically should apply to both men and to women, rather than being specifically extrovert associated with male and introvert with female, and so forth. But the point is that the accuracy of what we get increases simply because of the accuracy, the closeness of our own observation of what's going on. And if we ask the question in another way and look for specific gender differences, oh, I did have it ahead of us. Didn't realize that I had it put in there ahead. What I was leading up to is the following kind of a graph. If you analyze men and women's ratings of men and women and the features that they tend to associate with them, for men, both men and women tend to like men to be masculine. So that women rating a woman will be very close to neutral on the balance between whether it's more important to have feminine or masculine characteristics. Women rating men, on the other hand, tend to be biased slightly in the direction of having more masculine features. There's a slight tendency, a move significantly toward the male end of the scale, given the list, the categorization that I was sharing with you earlier. But then if we look at the men, interestingly, when a man is rating a man, he tends to move toward the masculine side. But in contrast to all 3 of these sets of values, look what happens when a man is rating a woman. In that case, he tends to prefer a woman to be markedly more feminine than masculine. Women feel the ideal woman should combine both masculine and feminine features, for instance, affectionate and gentle, and yet independent and forceful, though she'll be significantly more feminine than the ideal man in the ratings. And those findings tend to hold worldwide. That is, it really doesn't matter where you ask these kind of questions or conduct the research. You get the same findings all around the world. John Williams studied college students' ratings in countries ranging from New Zealand to India to Nigeria, and found 20 adjectives more often associated with men in 23 out of 25 countries that he studied. That's really a phenomenally stable set of data, that he had 20 adjectives that were consistently associated more often with men in 90%, over 90% of the countries that he studied. That's a remarkably stable finding. That also leads into the other thing that I wanted to look at just very briefly here, and that is essentially the idea of gender difference. Gender difference shows up in a variety of situations. Come back to me, don't go to that visual yet. One general observation that has been made across men and women is the fact that differences in ability as a function of gender are much more likely to be, first of all, published. They're more likely to be a topic of discussion among you and I, and they're more likely to draw attention. Differences in ability, when they occur, are focused on by all of us. But males and females' abilities show tremendous overlap in frequency distributions. That is the kind of thing where if you take an array of words to see what's going to be applied to a man relative to a woman, the overlap is tremendous. We tend to worry about the differences, those few words that I isolated that tend to go one way or the other. But across the vast majority of them, think of compassion. I mean, nobody wants an uncompassionate person as a member of the opposite sex. And so compassion would be one among many different features that tends to be linked to both sexes quite positively and frequently. What differences do exist, probably do exist for all kinds of people in all kinds of situations. On the other hand, by counter-argument, there are no gender differences in things like general intelligence. I started to say gender intelligence. There are no gender differences in general intelligence. If you plot a distribution of IQs measured on the same test, you get a distribution that ranges from 3 standard deviations below to 3 standard deviations above for 99 3/4% of us, and it's centered on 100, whether you're male or female. There are no differences in learning ability. There are no differences in memory. Amount learned, length retained, accuracy retained, conditions under which it's tested, and so forth. There are no differences ultimately in concept formation. Now keep in mind when I'm talking about this, when we're measuring this, this tends to be done in isolation. I'm not talking about in social groups. We'll talk in a minute about what the impact of measuring men and women in social situations may lead to or accentuate differences that otherwise are simply not there, not real. But for concept formation, it's essentially identical. You and I, whether male or female, can look at a given set of data, a given pattern of information or facts, and we'll generally tend to be equally adept in reaching particular conclusions or conceptual descriptions of what we've seen. No difference in reasoning skill. No difference in problem solving, whether under pressure or not. There's no difference in overall creativity. Excuse me. What differences are there? Well, in fact, there are remarkably few in most situations. There is some little bit of difference in spatial visual tasks. Let's back up a little bit. In spatial visualization tasks, what's involved there is if I were to say to you, imagine your bedroom in the color that it's currently painted, and what would happen if you redecorated it in blue with modern furniture? That would be essentially an application of a spatial visual task. I would be asking you to conceptualize what your bedroom looks like and then make a specific change in a direction of picking a favored color of blue and redoing it in that color and modern furniture. too easy to conceptualize changes. There's a very slight difference in males versus females' ability to do that. There's a moderate difference in spatial perception tasks. I'll show you some examples of those in just a minute. I can push that even further. Do you remember Shepard's study of mental rotation tasks? Shepard's not the right name. I'll think of it in a minute. I'll show you an example of what I'm talking about. There turn out to be substantial differences between men and women in this particular task. Okay, now let's put this on the screen, and I want to challenge you as follows. Hold up your hand when you realize or can define precisely whether the image on the right is a rotated image of the image on the left. Can we take the one on the left and rotate it clockwise or counterclockwise into the picture or out of the picture and replicate? Is it the same image? Left hand means no, right hand means yes. And then we're getting a kind of voting going on in the room there, but we always want to confirm. But in fact, in that situation, the answer is no, at least as best I can figure it. I designed this originally, and now I can't tell from, as far as I'm concerned, that's poking backwards. Okay? And on that basis then, if we were to rotate this, say 45 degrees to the right, yeah, this part would agree with this part, connected to the end of which would be 3 more blocks or 2 more blocks extending in this direction. But as I read it, what's been constructed there is the fact that this one would have to be on this back side in order to match this. Am I correct in that? That's what I'm seeing, and therefore I would suggest that the correct answer here is no. The one to the right is not a rotated image of the one on the left. Same thing, I'm going to give you another one. The question is going to be, can you take the image on the left and rotate it left or right or into or out of the picture and match up? Is it a matched version? Is it the same image rotated left or right, backward or forward? As rapidly as you can, give me an answer to this one. You're not, of course, looking at the studio at the moment, but there is a mixture of heads rotating. No, no, but nobody's hand is in the air yet. Sorry, one hand, 2 now. Okay? I would argue again that that's not equal. And the reason I would argue that way is the fact that, yes, if we use this vertical shaft of 3 as representing this, which is the only place where we've got 3 cubes in a row, this one is hanging off in the correct direction, but this one is not. Okay? That is, if we could say that this cube, this one, and this one are in the proper position. Okay? That is, you could rotate to the left by 45 degrees this image and get these 5 cubes in the same position, but this one is not. It should instead be on the end of the figure. It should be down here. Okay? And on that basis, then, I'm going to argue that no, this is not of correct mental rotation. Got one more for you. Same problem. Can you rotate the figure on the left or right, into or out of, and match the figure on the right? Okay, most of us have voted. And how do you say, Houston? I would argue in this case that the answer is yes. Okay? If you take the 4-block stretch, that has moved over to here. It's been slightly twisted, rotated, and tipped into the figure just a little bit. This block is where it was at the end on the same side, and down at the other end we have this block coming out the other side, which is this one. And we have this one rotated as it would be. That is, it's still attached on the same side as it was, and given that you've tipped the figure left and backward into the image, you've now ended up with the figure that you see on the right side there. That leads to an extraordinary set of studies on what turns out to be a very simple task, and that is mental rotation. But it turns out what they were able to demonstrate, in fact, I can show you the experimental results that were just stunning in terms of their consistency. And that is that if you rotate an object, and I'm not dealing with twisting it or you know, both into and out of, only left and right, the further you rotate the object, the longer it takes for the hands to go up. Or if you're in a button pushing situation where you either press a button that says no or one that says yes, in both cases, the net result is the further it has to be rotated, the longer it takes to do so. That is very powerful evidence, think about it a second, but very powerful evidence in favor of the fact that what you and I are doing is rotating an actual mental image. That is, that what we're dealing with in our head is an actual mental image or a representation of a mental image. It is not, for instance, converted into a verbal description, then add 45 degrees and then convert back, because if that were the case, whether it was a 45-degree rotation or a 75 or 110-degree rotation, it wouldn't matter, because the translation from image to description is the same in both cases. And so you would essentially, whether the figure was rotated 45 degrees or 180 degrees, which is the maximum you can, the ability to translate from the one to the second image would be the same, independent of the actual angle of rotation. So this was very, excuse me, very powerful evidence of the fact that we are in fact rotating actual mental images, three-dimensional images in our head, representations of the three. It turns out women are substantially different from men in their ability to do this particular skill, and there's no easy explanation as to why that actually happens. Pardon me, I'll trust myself for some drinking here. The one other thing where differences might seem to exist is mathematical ability, and it turns out they don't. The differences are negative, except possibly for problem solving after middle school. From senior high school onward, women are in some cases slightly slower in solving word problems, essentially problem solving. And it shows up to a certain extent in SAT math tests as an example. How do we explain that? Well, there are a bunch of different ways in which you can jump to look for potential explanations. One would be to look at biological factors or biological causes. There's no genetic difference that can be demonstrated that impacts the kind of things we're measuring here. There's no demonstrable genetic impact that's feasible in this particular situation. Hormones? Well, maybe, because there are differences hormonally within each of us. But if you want to adopt that as a potential explanation, what you're then left with is what nobody has been able to provide, and that is, well, okay, what's the mechanism? If we want to say, okay, there are hormonal differences, that's the explanation. Well, okay, how? Where's the mechanism? What do the hormones weigh in on and alter in one way or another? Nobody's been able to answer that question. Another possibility is brain organization. Essentially what you're leading into here, excuse me, is the issue of lateralization, the left hemisphere, right hemisphere, relative specialization. They're very complex theories that are involved there, but there's no convincing evidence as to why lateralization would influence limited tasks. I should say the tasks where there is limited evidence that some difference does exist, male versus female. We could look at social factors. Excuse me, I may have to stop lecturing here very shortly. There are differences in cognition that might be chargeable to differential experience with math. Well, that might be arguable, because certainly by the time you get into high school, there is a tendency for there to be more males in math classes than females. And certainly by the time you get into college, a female math major is an eye-opening exception. Same with engineering. Less so now. We are beginning to equalize ourselves as sex roles themselves are changing. But there might be a social explanation for why there is that difference in facility. Maybe it's different extracurricular activities. Is there implicitly, for instance, more math involved in the sports activities that boys tend to be encouraged into? Well, it's a possibility. It's studyable, but no clear explanation on it at the moment. Certainly the games that are played tend to differ. In high school, you're more often likely to see females playing soccer, for instance, than football. You're more likely to see males playing football than soccer. So there is some difference in the sports that we actually engage in. It is known, this is kind of tragic, but it is known that teachers tend to attend more to a boy in math in school, in middle school and beyond. Males tend to get more hands-on attention from teachers in math classes from middle school onward than do girls. There are various kinds of models. You can go 18 different directions with this kind of a social explanation. But if you look at movies, as an example, you're much more likely to see, name in your head, the shows on television right now, and this, of course, will change from this year to next to the following. But name right now as many shows as you can where the star is a female, where the series is focused on a female. And there aren't many. There are a few, even by title, but there aren't many. The differences in attitude might be due to variations in perceived confidence. At some point, all of this experience or lack thereof tends to weigh back on the individuals, and males become big-headed, and females may harbor, legitimately or not, worries about their relative competence. And I think I've cited enough reasons to suggest that there's no basis for worry. There are social things that can be changed. Another possibility is that the differences really are attributable to different views of math's usefulness. You may, as a woman, simply have a dismissive attitude toward math based on the career that you envision for yourself, and what the relative usefulness of math is in the career that you envision. At this point, given my throat, I'm going to stop lecturing. Wish you well, and we'll pick up the other half of gender development at the beginning of the next, well, in fact, the entirety of the next lecture.